$5 trillion. That is how much the US markets have lost since Donald Trump announced the new US tariffs. Welcome back to episode 82 of This Week in E-Commerce. I am Chia, taking you through another week of the top headlines affecting retailers. And unless you've been living under a rock, there is really only one headline which you should probably be reading most about at the moment, which is the impact of the new US tariffs and what that means for you. Now, this is obviously a topic which we have covered a few times already. First of all, with Stuart Smith from Global E, and then more recently with Justin Irvine from the Aggregate Co. But with the new announcement last week, it has thrown the entire world economy into a tailspin. Now, how much of a tailspin? The sell-off in the market, which has occurred over the last couple of days, which is the $5 trillion in America and the $160 billion here in Australia, which happened this morning on Monday. There's really only two other historical precedents for a drop this big, which is the GFC back in 2008, and then also in March 2020, the very start of COVID and the pandemic. So this is, again, just completely unprecedented, where this is something which one person has been able to put into effect, all with the wave of a pen. But before we get into that, we are going to start off with some other news, which is about Q Clothing. Now, every week we seem to be talking about a different legacy clothing brand here in Australia, and this week we're going to be talking about Q, but not because they have decided to close down, but because they've actually been acquired. Now, they have been acquired by UK investment firm Hilco Capital, who are well known for acquiring retail brands and revitalizing them through operational streamlining and generally improving the business overall. Now, Q and its sister brand Veronica Maine have both been acquired. Now, for those who don't know Q had been one of the cornerstones of Australian fashion for decades now. They were founded in 1968 by the Levi family, who built its reputation on sophisticated workwear, contemporary design, and most importantly, local manufacturing. And Q to this day continue to manufacture, I believe, all of their products right here in Australia, which is generally unheard of in this age of globalization, but then also just generally offshoring to cheaper manufacturers overseas. So this is so important because Q are one of those iconic brands and stalwarts of local production. And so particularly with everyone moving overseas, they have represented how important it is to continue to maintain that local presence. And it's really something which they've built up as being one of the hallmarks of the brand. But like with a lot of businesses in this sector who are feeling the pinch, not just post-COVID, but also from the increased competition in this space as well, they have been experiencing a lot of financial pressures over the last few years. Number one being the rising cost of material, manufacturing, but also the increasing cost of the retail spaces, continuing to squeeze margins, not just for them, but across the industry. But also for Q, the fact that they are focusing on local manufacturing as well means that things also get more expensive here as well, particularly with wage growth and the cost of living pressures, etc., which are really driving up the cost and making it harder for people to manufacturing onshore, which we'll get into a little bit later with what the US is trying to do at the moment. But you can see how with all of these as well, it's kind of led to this perfect storm for them, which has led to not just the financial pressures, but also leading to some leadership shakeups, which have happened, but also internal family disputes amongst the Levi family who founded Q as well, which have further helped to complicate their way of doing business. So they've been a family-owned company for generations, and succession planning is one of probably the most underrated parts about operating family business, and one of the most challenging parts as well. Now, I've had a bit of experience to deal with that. I know experts to deal with the succession planning in family businesses, and it's not easy, particularly getting everyone on the same page. Now, what makes this particularly interesting is that, like I talked about before with Hilco Capital, is that Hilco have a really great track record of acquiring and revitalizing retail businesses. So they specialize in operational turnarounds and have worked with lots of brands across the UK and Europe to help turn them around. So there's a pretty good chance here that they'll be able to take what Q currently have, which is a really great business model and a brand which is very well respected and doing some really unique, innovative things, and is a bit more elevated than some of the other brands you see in the market here, and hopefully being able to turn this around. So there's a lot of implications of what this can mean. So number one is that we're likely to see some of that streamlining of the operations of Q. So by no means are they looking to shut anything down, from what I understand. They may even maintain the local manufacturing commitment, which has been central to Q's identity, but also potentially looking to tap into Hilco's global expertise as well and actually expand the brand overseas. So actually accelerate the international growth of Q into new markets as well. But also with new ownership, you're likely to see some new creativity and innovation come into the space as well. Yeah, so I'm really curious to see what happens with the Q brand, whether they're going to be able to refresh the brand, take a few risks to help make them special again in this space. And I've been lucky enough to know quite a few people from Q over the years, and they're all incredibly smart, talented, creative people. So I'm super excited to see whether this trend will continue and Q will be able to be revitalized for this new era of retail. So a bit of a feel-good story to start off with, because I'm about to go into the absolute bloodbath of the last week or so. Last Tuesday, Donald Trump announced sweeping US tariffs on what he called Liberation Day, which is an effort to bring local manufacturing back into the US and usher in a new age of US prosperity. Also, the rhetoric goes. But however, at the global scale, we're starting to see some really significant impacts ripple all across the entire global economy, of which Australia is definitely not immune. Like I mentioned before, the $160 billion wipeout in the ASX stock market. We can also see that similar scenario play out in every other country as well. Whether you're in Germany, London, Japan, where the Nikkei is significantly down. This has had ripple effects all across the world. Speaking of Japan, Japan are probably one of the most hit countries in the fact that they rely very heavily on America for exports. So in terms of cars, but also consumer electronics as well, which are two of the major exports out of Japan, the US is their number one customer. So you can see this is now going to be impacting a country like Japan more significantly than it impacts a country like Australia, where while the US is our biggest trading partner, we're fairly diversified in the fact that we do work with a lot of different countries as well. This problem isn't just something which is happening in America, it's happening all across the world. So in particular, the numbers with these tariffs are that there's now a 24% tariff on Chinese imports. So basically any product which is manufactured in China and going into America now attracts a 24% tariff. So just that number alone is fairly significant, where when you consider that essentially works out to somewhere about a 12 to 15% reduction in gross margin across any affected category. Brand, which typically has somewhere between a 40 to 60% gross margin, maybe 70% if you're lucky, this is a really significant hit to your operating margin, meaning that you now have to do much more with less. And we can see that since this announcement as well, there's also been a big change in terms of how we're looking to trade with different countries. A lot of businesses I work with are now really, really quickly rethinking what their US strategy is to look at, can we actually diversify into other markets, or do we need to look at changing our pricing to be able to absorb some of these tariffs so it doesn't affect our operating margin too much. But realistically, that's a bit of a longer game to play to figure out what that is. And also, who knows what's going to happen in the US. And some businesses are now looking to other countries, whether it be the US or the UK, to start thinking about whether we can actually start replacing some of that lost revenue from the US with another country. And we've now also seen this whole wipeout in the stock market as well, where it's now putting a lot of pressure on the capital markets with lower investor confidence. A lot of the superannuation funds, the fund Ks in the US, which are tied to stocks, suddenly losing a large chunk of their value. So if you're someone who's looking to retire fairly soon and you have a lot of money tied up in stocks, particularly with your super, that's now worth significantly less today than it was 5 days ago or 7 days ago. So there's this additional pressure in the markets as well, because the markets are now so volatile as well. So there's what's known as the volatility index, the CBE volatility index, VIX, which indicates how uncertain the market is. And right now, the VIX is at its highest point it has been in many, many years, suggesting that no one knows what is happening right now. Because that also kind of goes to the heart of what this situation is, where the trillion-dollar question is, are these tariffs here for the long term, or are they merely a negotiation tactic? And that's something which, if you've been reading the headlines, Trump himself seems to be flip-flopping on, where you have his son who's going out and saying that countries need to come to the bargaining table and negotiate a deal now, and Trump himself saying that, then quickly backflipping and saying that the tariffs are here to stay and it's part of the long-term economic policy. And you can see some Trump advisors also started to say that as well. So we're a bit on the fence about what this actually is, whether it is something which is going to be long-term economic policy, which they're going to pursue because they're trying to usher in this age of American prosperity, or whether it is just a ploy to bring people to the bargaining table. Because already he's flagged that Vietnam have reached out and are looking to make a deal. And after all, that is what Donald Trump's all about, which is making a deal. But this uncertainty is also what's driving the current behavior in the markets, where investors and business like to have consistency and like to have some certainty in terms of what we're going to do. We're not going to make big, bold bets if we don't have a pretty good probability they're going to play out. But if we can see that policy can flip-flop from one day to another day to another day, how can you actually plan for the future with that? Having said that, though, from the conversations which I've been having with all the experts in this field, such as Justin, Stewart, is that we should be planning for this to become the new normal, that this is what life is going to be, because for the foreseeable future, it doesn't look like these tariffs are going to go anywhere. While they won't come into effect until the 2nd of May, they're likely going to be here for months, if not years, maybe until the next administration, depending on who that is. So what everyone should be thinking about is, how do we actually adapt to this and adapt quickly? There's no point trying to put your head into the sand and hope that this works itself out. We really need to be thinking about, what are you going to be doing to adapt to this new reality? And we've talked about some of those responses. We've talked about looking at your pricing as a first step, looking at how you can redo your pricing to hopefully absorb some of these additional costs to your business, which is going to affect demand. No doubt about that. That will 100% affect demand, but it's a short-term fix because people are expecting prices to go up everywhere. And even in the last week or so, you can see through a lot of different consumer goods, a lot of people are starting to increase their prices, particularly if you rely on imports from the US or anywhere really. You're expecting prices to go up because that's what businesses do. They don't just absorb the cost. They will typically try to pass the cost on to the consumer, whether that consumer is a retail consumer or a business consumer. The second is around a 3PL, in terms of making sure that if you are selling to the US, you start exploring an onshore US 3PL. The reason for that is quite simple, because you're better off paying the tariff on your landed cost of goods to the US than the retail cost of goods. So hopefully you can just increase that 34% on your COGS versus doing it on your full price good, which is going to impact the customer a lot more. But then also, we've previously talked about diversification and looking at alternative hubs for manufacturing. This is looking at areas like Vietnam, India, Bangladesh. Now, that was before we knew that the tariffs were going to hit everyone, because if you look at some of the numbers which have been bandied about, it appears that those numbers affect everyone. Those tariffs are going to affect every single country. The reason why is that these are retaliatory tariffs. In terms of perceived slights against the US, they're now looking to implement them where the US believes that it has been operating at an unfair advantage, which unfortunately means that some of these countries like Vietnam, India, Malaysia are being targeted. So that alternative manufacturing is no longer the solution we thought it could be. So what is the government currently doing to combat this? Well, right now, not a whole lot. So the government has pretty much made some comments around that this is not how a friend acts, and I would 100% agree with that, that this is not something which was done in the spirit of partnership. It was done very unilaterally, and it was done to other countries rather than in partnership with other countries. So Australia is working with the WTO to figure out solutions through this rather than direct retaliatory measures. And while we've seen some countries retaliate with their own tariffs, this is not something which I believe Australia would actually do, given our relative economic size to the US. But we're starting to see some really significant growing public sentiment against these trade policies as well, not just from the global economy, but also from their own people, where over 2/3 of Americans, are now considering the fact that their prices are going to get higher. And while the administration is saying that they need to accept some short-term pain for long-term gain, it doesn't appear that consumers are really wanting that. And they're not prepared to actually take on even more of a burden now when they don't really know what's to come and where this could potentially finish up. And for once, we're starting to see some cross-party unity where both parties are now in lockstep in the fact that they are looking to push back on this and to work with the US administration to hopefully ease some of these tariffs, because they recognize how serious this is for Australian businesses and Australian consumers, and it could push us into another recession. So While these macroeconomic shifts are continuing to transform business at such a rapid rate, and this situation is evolving daily, there are also a lot of technological changes as well, which are also simultaneously transforming how retailers operate. And I'm going to talk to you about ChatGPT and their latest advances in AI image generation. Now, if you hadn't seen it over the last couple of weeks, you would have seen a lot of memes on LinkedIn, Instagram with anything you can imagine, famous scenes from movies done in a Studio Ghibli style. Now, while I am 100% over seeing that particular example, it does say a lot about how far ChatGPT's image generation capabilities have grown in a relatively short period of time. Now, it was only last year where they were debuting this functionality, maybe even 6 months ago. But since then, it has improved dramatically. It hasn't just been incremental. It has been a complete step change in terms of what's possible with AI-assisted creative production. So what makes this really interesting for retailers is the quality and the specificity of how the images can be generated. Whereas before, it would do a fairly crude approximation of what you wanted. Even if you uploaded a product, gave it very specific instructions, it would give you something pretty ordinary, and not even ordinary, it'd be flat out rubbish. But a lot of that has changed in a short period of time, showing that what you can actually do now is actually give it very specific commands. You can actually upload packaging, for instance, tell it what the product and category is, and come up with an idea for an ad. Or take a model and a product and say, put this product on that model, put this product in a specific situation, and it'll come out with something which is actually not too bad. Now, whether it's commercial quality or not, that's roughly in the eye of the beholder. My view is that it's still probably only about 80% of the way there, but it's still not too bad for where it needs to get to. And you can kind of see what's coming up on the horizon. Now, is it great? Definitely not. But it's good enough in a lot of fairly plain cases. There is no human creativity. There is no spark of genius which goes into this. It is pretty generic. But sometimes generic is what you need, particularly when you consider the fact that with all the advertising platforms we use now, whether it be Meta, Google, TikTok, the sheer velocity of creative we need for these platforms is, quite frankly, just getting out of control, where it's to the point where a human will struggle to keep up with the volume of creative which is required. So you can see with this new technology and how it's going to revolutionize advertising is that suddenly the creative production, particularly for that lower end production, which is swapping out background images, putting the product into different situations, just e-com shots. These are things which would previously require professional designers, photographers, stylists, some post-production. This can now be accomplished at a fraction of the cost in the blink of an eye. And already one of the brands who I'm working with are starting to use this much more in their day-to-day production. While they're still doing a lot of the campaign production with their campaign shoots for the high-level stuff, some of the product photography, such as taking the product and putting it underwater, putting it on a trail, putting it on the wrist of someone who is riding a mountain bike, that's something which can now be done very, very quickly in a way which someone can take that image and quickly overlay some text and put it up as an ad. Because again, the machines are now so hungry for creative that we can actually spin up a lot of different iterations very, very quickly to be able to push the algorithms and achieve lower CPMs and lower cost per clicks by continuing to pump it full of creative, which doesn't need to be great, but needs to be enough and good enough to be able to inform the machine and improve the targeting of it. And already we're starting to see some results. Now, some of these results come from the brands themselves, so I should say the technology themselves, such as furniture retailers are reporting 24% increases in conversion rates based on being able to artificially generate the product in someone's home to be able to stand out from regular product photos, or beauty brands who are able to leverage this for before and after visualizations based on customers' skin tones and concerns, or activewear brands like I've worked with before who are starting to use this for the run-of-the-mill production costs, but able to get them out faster and different iterations so that they can actually push the advertising platforms more than what they previously were. But like with anything, there are downsides to go with those upsides, which is around the issue of intellectual property and copyright still being a bit unsure that when you use some of these consumer AI tools to generate, where does that copyright then live? Does that copyright then live with ChatGPT when you generate it on there? Or do you retain that? So some of that still needs to be figured out, but also around homogenization as well, which is as more and more people rely on AI, AI is just going to become dumber and dumber and dumber, which means that we lack that human creativity. Things become more and more generic as we go. So it's making sure that we continue to actually bring in elements of human creativity rather than relying wholly and solely on AI to do all the thinking for us, but also around authenticity as well, looking at where AI begins and human ends, or vice versa. And how do we ensure that representation and authenticity are core to everything which we do? Because I can imagine a world where everything looks far too AI and we just don't trust it and we become mistrustful of it. Or AI puts things in situations which aren't real, which then leads to misleading and deceptive conduct. And if you look recently at the new Bonds ad featuring Rob Irwin, I watched that about 3 to 4 times, wondering how, like, it just looked very fake just because everything which was around it. Now, I get the overall premise of it, and it's a great ad once I actually was able to step back and take a look. But my first couple of times watching it, I was convinced it was wholly AI. And don't get me wrong, parts of it definitely are AI, but it actually had a human in it. And it was hard to discern whether that was a human or not, with all that AI which was going on. So for retailers, this is a great opportunity for you to start testing this technology to see how you could apply it to your own work, to speed up your workflows, to reduce your costs, particularly with the margin squeezes we're seeing from the Trump tariffs, but also making sure that if you are going to go in this space, you've got some really clear guidelines for how this content is going to be used and how it is going to remain consistent with your brand as well. And that's one of the great things about what ChatGPT has been able to do with their new capabilities, in that you can actually have it align with what your brand guidelines are, so it doesn't look completely out of whack. So as we wrap up this week's episode, there's so much going on right now. It's all about the tariffs for me, as it should be for most people listening today, but also not forgetting as well where to find the opportunity. As Winston Churchill says, never let a good crisis go to waste. And this is one of those times of crisis where you should be looking for those opportunities to really figure out how I can run a much more operationally efficient, leaner, and agile business, but also start to look for new opportunities as well, either here domestically or finding new international markets to look to expand into. And definitely the AI front, keep testing that out. This is a great opportunity for everyone to be looking at and figuring out how can we start leveraging this technology better. Retail is one of the areas which is probably only about 24% or so adoption in AI. So we have a long way to go in terms of actually normalizing the use of AI in our work. And when you can see the advances which are happening in tools like Shopify, Klaviyo, Meta, around how AI is being used in their products, you need to understand how this works and how you can get ahead of the curve, because AI is a great leveler, but only if you know how to use it well. So with that in mind, thanks for listening, everyone. Have a great week. Keep innovating, keep selling, keep growing, and we'll see you back here next week on This Week in E-commerce.